Russian influence operations to undermine investigations into Russian interference. The committee observed numerous Russian government actors from late 2016 until at least January 2020, consistently spreading overlapping false narratives which sought to discredit investigations into Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. elections and spread false information about the events of 2016. Manafort, Kilimnik, Deripaska, and others associated with Deripaska participated in these influence operations. As part of these efforts, Manafort and Kilimnik both sought to promote the narrative that Ukraine, not Russia, had interfered in the 2016 U.S. election, and that the, quote, ledger, close quote, naming payments to Manafort was fake. These efforts coincided with a, redacted, and related efforts by Deripaska to discredit investigations into Russian meddling. Similarities in narrative content, the use of common dissemination platforms, the involvement of Kremlin agents Kilimnik and Deripaska, and, redacted, all suggest that these influence efforts were coordinated to some degree. These influence efforts took place in the larger context of existing Russian information operations targeting Ukraine and the United States. 2 paragraphs on page 107 are redacted. In August 2016, immediately after news articles regarding Manafort's work in Ukraine, Manafort and Kilimnik began discussing the Ukrainian government's supposed involvement in the reporting. Manafort claimed that then-Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko was behind the media campaign to, quote, smear, close quote, Manafort. Manafort said Poroshenko had fabricated the, quote, black ledger, close quote, and was supporting Hillary Clinton. Manafort recalled that, at some point, Leo Ovechkin heard from Poroshenko that the U.S. Embassy was pressuring Ukraine's National Anti-Corruption Bureau for information on Manafort. Kilimnik promoted the narrative that the Ukrainian authorities had, quote, artificially instigated, close quote, stories related to Manafort's work in Ukraine, including the alleged black ledger. The day after Manafort resigned, Kilimnik was coordinating with Manafort to counteract negative public media. For example, Kilimnik wrote an email to Patton in which he said that he was, quote, talking to PJM, close quote, and suggested they were considering suing reporters who published negative articles about Kilimnik and Manafort. Kilimnik almost certainly helped arrange some of the first public messaging that Ukraine had interfered in the U.S. election. On August 23, 2016, Kilimnik exchanged emails with Roman Olyarchik, a journalist with the Financial Times in Kyiv. 5 days later, the Financial Times published an article by Olyarchik entitled, quote, Ukraine's leaders campaign against pro-Putin Trump, close quote. The article quoted, quote, a former Yanukovych loyalist now playing a lead role in the region's party successor, called Opposition Bloc, close quote, who, according to the article, quote, let loose a string of expletives, close quote, and, quote, accused Western media of working in the interests of Hillary Clinton by trying to bring down Trump, close quote. After the article was published, Kilimnik shared the article with Gates with the subject, quote, FT, unbelievable, close quote. In the email, Kilimnik explained to Gates that, quote, these idiots actually admit that PP's government was deliberately trying to destabilize Trump's campaign. Kilimnik told Gates that, quote, this article is actually helpful to us, close quote, and said he hopes that DT sees it. Kilimnik also updated Manafort on the Ukrainian government's investigation into Manafort and other related investigations, including their key players and progress. In late November 2016, Kilimnik sent Manafort a summary of an interview with the head of Ukraine's Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, SAPO. In the email, Kilimnik explained to Manafort that parts of the interview were, quote, very relevant to us, close quote, and highlighted several narratives, including around Ukrainian parliamentarian Serhiy Leshchenko's role in the release of the, quote, black ledger, close quote. The prosecutor, who is investigating the case, is basically making a point that A, the scans of alleged black ledger appeared in public domain in violation of existing procedures and were used for a specific purpose by Leshchenko and Avakov. B, there is no evidence that any of that stuff is real, and have been no real movement since the beginning of investigation in August, and C, There are absolutely no grounds to suspect anyone, especially PJM, in this whole thing. Manafort appears to have been involved in efforts to arrange a call between Poroshenko and Trump after the election, which appears to have been motivated by Manafort's own interest in countering these same Ukrainian criminal investigations. On November 10, 2016, Kalimnik forwarded a foreign press article to Manafort and Gates about the investigations in Ukraine. The article discussed Ukrainian politicians aligned with Poroshenko's political party who would reverse course after Trump's victory and were now accusing Leshchenko of, quote, falsifying evidence, close quote, in a Ukrainian criminal case related to Manafort. Kalimnik believed that Leshchenko was, quote, part of the group of deputies who launched a PR offensive in coordination with HRC HQ and poured mud over us in the media, using false evidence and copies of something resembling, quote, black accounting book of PR, close quote. After receiving Kalimnik's November 10, 2016 email, Manafort messaged Gates, writing, quote, this makes the Frank project even more timely. Let me know if Frank, Mahmoud, can do what we discussed, close quote. According to Gates, Manafort had asked Gates to reach out to Mahmoud to offer Manafort's assistant to then Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, Valery Chali, in repairing relationships Manafort believed Poroshenko had damaged. The next day, November 11, 2016, Mahmoud emailed Chali and asked for a phone call to discuss the matter which Mahmoud said Chali would find, quote, of interest and value, close quote. Mahmoud informed Gates that he had messaged Chali, quote, to ask for a phone call, close quote. On November 13, 2016, Mahmoud forwarded to Gates a message which Mahmoud had received from Chali, stating, quote, got it. We are in contact with his executive assistant, Ms. Rona Graf, still waiting for confirmation of slot for a phone call by my president on Tuesday, close quote. On November 15, 2016, Trump and Poroshenko held their first call. After the call, Mahmoud and Gates discussed arranging a meeting between Manafort and Chali. On November 22, 2016, Mahmoud messaged Gates, quote, Ambo just called me, said he would welcome meeting with Paul. He has some information to share, close quote. Gates responded, quote, interesting. I will share with P, close quote. Several days later, Mahmoud informed Gates that he would be meeting with Chali on a separate subject soon and asked if he had, quote, any guidance, close quote, from Manafort. Gates responded that the, quote, only guidance is to reinforce the previous points, close quote, and to tell Chali that Manafort had, quote, helped organize the call between the two presidents, close quote. Mahmoud met with Chali the next day. Redacted. While he was discussing Ukrainian investigations with Manafort, Kalimnik helped write an opinion article under Leovochkin's name that included similar themes. Kalimnik and Patton circulated a draft of the article in January 2017, which included language suggesting that Ukraine's National Anti-Corruption Bureau, NABU, had, quote, manufactured a case, close quote, against Manafort. The article further insinuated that Trump had no Russia ties, stating that there was, quote, no real fire behind all this smoke, close quote. The article ultimately was published by U.S. News & World Report on February 6, 2017. Manafort embraced and promoted the narrative of Ukraine's alleged involvement in the 2016 elections. For example, in a February 2017 meeting with Donald Trump Jr., Manafort discussed how Ukraine, not Russia, had meddled in the election. In an email to Trump Jr., Manafort shared a Politico article that seems to have underpinned repeated claims by others helping advance this narrative. Content of email. From Paul Manafort, sent 2/14/2017, to Donald Trump Jr. Subject: enjoyed our meeting. Don, it was great to reconnect. I am pursuing the topics we discussed and will be back to you. On a separate note, I have pasted below the Ken Vogel story in Politico that ran about 3 weeks ago. He lays out clearly the conspiracy to implement the disinformation campaign on me between the DNC/Obama administration and the government of Ukraine. The Ukraine government has now totally backed off, saying there is no interest ever in me and the ledger was a falsified document. Of course, now with the Flynn resignation, all of this will be dragged up again, with no facts and no basis for anything. Best, Paul. As described above, in late February 2017, Manafort met with Kilimnik in Madrid to discuss the Russia-related investigations, including the one in Ukraine, which Kilimnik said was, quote, going nowhere, close quote. Large portions of the report's page 113 are redacted. The available text is, given Kilimnik's communications with, Kilimnik's overlapping efforts with Manafort, and it is likely that some coordination occurred between Deripaska-directed efforts and those undertaken by Kilimnik and Manafort. Redacted. On March 22, 2017, the Associated Press published an article stating that Manafort had in the mid-2000s proposed a confidential plan to influence politics, business dealings, and news coverage to, quote, greatly benefit the Putin government, close quote. Shortly thereafter, on March 25, 2017, Waldman discussed with Vice Chairman Warner the possibility of a potential committee engagement with Deripaska. Waldman said he raised the idea with Deripaska, who would be in London in the coming days, and that Deripaska was potentially interested in the engagement. On March 28, 2017, Deripaska took out several large advertisements in major U.S. newspapers offering to testify before the SSCI and the HPSCI. Waldman later explained that he understood that Deripaska intended to testify not about potential election interference, but rather about Manafort. As of June 2017, Kilimnik continued to engage with Manafort on Ukrainian investigations related to Manafort. Kilimnik emailed Manafort about statements from Ukraine's SAPO, including a statement claiming that Manafort was not a subject of SAPO's investigation into the Black Ledger because of lack of evidence. Kilimnik told Manafort that the statement was, quote, a big deal, close quote, and suggested that, quote, your people should see this, close quote. Also in mid-2017, other Russian government proxies and personas worked to spread the false narrative that Ukraine interfered in the U.S. election. On July 12, 2017, CyberBearcoot, which had been dormant for months, alleged on its blog that Ukraine had interfered in the 2016 U.S. elections. In the post, CyberBearcoot claimed that hacked emails revealed a set of financial transactions between Viktor Pinchuk and the Clinton Foundation. On July 13, 2017, at USA_Gunslinger, a long-running false persona account of the Internet Research Agency, IRA, tweeted about, quote, Clinton and her campaign team's collusion with Ukraine to interfere in the U.S. election, close quote. Redacted. On July 24, 2017, Ukrainian parliamentarian Andrei Durchak sent a letter to then Ukrainian Prosecutor General Yuri Lutsenko to ask Lutsenko to investigate, quote, interference, close quote, in the 2016 U.S. elections, particularly as it related to NABU's role in this interference. Redacted. Kilimnik also worked to conduct messaging to U.S. government officials and the media to undercut other Ukrainian government investigations related to Manafort. In September 2017, Kilimnik shared a letter with Patton that Leo Vochkin and his OB associates drafted allegedly on behalf of Oleksandr Lavrinovich. Lavrinovich is a former Ukrainian justice minister who was involved in Manafort's 2011 hiring of U.S. law firm Skadden, Arps, Marr & Flom, LLP, for Ukraine-related work, and who had come under investigation by Ukrainian authorities. Leo Vochkin wanted to use Kilimnik to push this letter to embassies and the media. Kilimnik also noted that Leo Vochkin separately wanted to write a similar letter to U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine Marie Yovanovitch and U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations Kurt Volker on the matter. The bottom of page 115 through the top of page 117, redacted. Page 117. On May 14, 2018, Solomon published an article in The Hill titled, quote, Mueller may have a conflict, and it leads directly to a Russian oligarch, close quote, which outlined, redacted, including Deripaska's alleged cooperation with the FBI on matters related to Robert Levinson, and implying that his history with the FBI might create a, quote, conflict, close quote, for the SCO. Solomon appeared on Hannity's television show that evening to discuss the same allegations. Page 118, redacted except for the following. On March 20, 2019, Solomon published an article from an interview he conducted with former Ukrainian Prosecutor General Yuri Lutsenko. In the interview, Lutsenko made the false claim that in 2016, the then U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, passed him a list of individuals who should not be prosecuted. The day Solomon's article was published, Trump retweeted it. A supposed copy of the list turned up in an online forum. On the same day, Solomon published a second article derived from the same interview with Lutsenko. That article repeated Lutsenko's claim that he had, quote, opened a probe into alleged attempts by Ukrainians to interfere in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Close quote. Kalimnik, using an alias Twitter account, registered under a false persona, retweeted the story. Kalimnik had previously reached out to Lutsenko in late 2016 in an apparent effort to propose that Lutsenko pursue political office with the assistance of Kalimnik and others. In November 2016, Patton and Kalimnik arranged for a polling company to test the viability of a new political party which would include Klitschko, Lutsenko, and two other Ukrainian political figures. The poll work was likely funded by Lyovichkin. Email communications suggest Patton reviewed the proposal and Kalimnik planned to deliver the proposal to Lutsenko in December 2016, per Lyovichkin's instructions. Redacted. Starting in 2017 and continuing at least until late 2019, Kalimnik used an alias Twitter account registered under a false persona to push a variety of false information, much of which centered on efforts to discredit the Russian investigations and assert that Ukraine, not Russia, had intervened in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Kalimnik repeatedly tweeted information related to the Bidens and Ukraine, much of which originated from Solomon. For example, on April 1, 2019, Kalimnik retweeted Solomon's own tweet linking to his article in The Hill titled, quote, Joe Biden's 2020 Ukrainian Nightmare, a closed probe is revived, close quote. On May 14, 2019, Kalimnik tweeted, quote, Ukraine's Prosecutor General Lutsenko is ready to provide payment orders concerning Hunter Biden, says there are payments for millions USD, close quote, and attached a link to an article about the issue. On September 16, 2018, Kalimnik retweeted a tweet by Donald Trump which stated, quote, the illegal Mueller witch hunt continues in search of a crime. There was never collusion with Russia, except by the Clinton campaign, close quote. On August 22, 2018, Kalimnik retweeted Sputnik reporter Lee Stranahan's tweet related to the allegations that Alexander Chalupa, a former DNC contractor, was involved in interfering in the U.S. elections and that the, quote, real, close quote, election interference had been between the DNC and Ukraine. Kalimnik retweeted Stranahan or others restating Stranahan's claims on this theme dozens of times. In January 2019, Kalimnik used his Personas account to send a single direct message to Stranahan. Redacted. Top half of page 121, redacted.